be allowed to proceed.
My Lords, I'm totally opposed to this bill, not least because it's an act of evasion, avoiding tackling some genuinely dire problems in public services. Instead, it aims to punish ordinary people for daring to ask the perfectly reasonable question, will you give us pay rises in line with inflation to get us through this economic crisis, a crisis which is not of our making? Yesterday, I spent hours in this chamber listening to some fine rhetoric from the government and across the House about levelling up, about improving the lives and living standards of millions of people struggling because of where they live, because of lack of opportunities. I confess I had some qualms about a paternalistic tone in terms of helping the northern poor. But what's interesting today is we encounter real workers, not passive supplicants, standing up for themselves, sometimes bolshy and angry, unwilling to be forced to accept a pay cut. And what's the government's response to workers fighting for a bit of DIY levelling up? To call their actions selfish, greedy, and smear them as a risk to public safety. Yet again, we're offered a law that is unnecessary. Lord Moore of Etchingham wrote an excellent article recently in which he noted, quote, "The itch to announce a new law often feels irresistible to governments, but it always has bad results." The Minister should read the article because it's a warning of unintended consequences of over-legislating. There are already a plethora of laws that arm the state with emergency powers to ensure strike action doesn't seriously threaten people's welfare and ensures life and limb cover. What's more, the mechanism of the law has been used as a blunt instrument since the 80s to weaken trade union power. So being able to legally call a strike requires a ridiculously high but arbitrary turnout and voting threshold of 40% and 50% respectively. Note, that's not a threshold this unelected chamber would often reach, and we have the temerity to make the laws of the land. But despite the 2016 Trade Union Act setting such onerous strike-busting restrictions, the recent turnouts in strike ballots across workplaces have smashed through those obstacles. You'd hope that that might give the government pause for thought to ask why so many working people who the state relies on to man railways, treat the ill, put out fires, guard borders, teach our kids and so on, are so unhappy at work that even sectors that haven't voted to strike for decades are now dialling tools. This should prompt politicians to take these people and their demands seriously. But no, instead, they drag out some Thatcherite clichés about the 1970s and, as always, think the solution is more illiberal law, to change the rules to make striking even harder. But in the haste to play the hard man, we end up with a shoddy piece of legislation that even Jacob Rees-Mogg has described as badly written and that it smacks of incompetence. The Secretary of State, Grant Shapps, in introducing the bill in the other place, and we've heard various iterations of this here today, tried to gaslight trade unionists with this repetition: this is not an attack on the right to strike. But with even more cynicism, he emphasised that the bill is about the rights of the public who, quote, work hard and expect essential services that they pay for to be there when they need them. Well, hear to that. But if your object is to give public services to the public when they need them, why focus on strikers as the culprits for poor service? Why not target those who consistently run poor services? Let me tell you, as a regular Avanti West train user, there's been little difference between strike and non-strike days for months and months. And where are the minimum service regulations or punishments for train operators when trains are routinely cancelled or late? For those at the top of the NHS responsible for the public-facing waiting lists of years for treatment? What mechanisms do we have to impose minimum services on government departments who have singularly failed to control our national borders? Or will the government blame the small boats crisis on strikers too? Indeed, this whole bill smacks of a cynical attempt at scapegoating striking workers for the wretched state of public services. It is just an unjustified smear to suggest strikers are putting public's lives at risk. And I find it particularly galling because one singular policy recently really did deny people health and social service and put their health at risk with dire consequences, and that was the shutting down of society for years in response to the pandemic, who turned the NHS into a COVID who turned the NHS into a COVID-only service with no regard for minimum service provision for those at risk of cancer, heart disease, strokes. Not even life and limb cover was provided. And while we might not all agree in here on lockdown policies, my point is, those of us who argued for a more proportionate response to COVID, for maintaining services, were often shooed away. And those services are now still creaking to recover, and long-term damage and suffering caused to the public, especially children, is as a consequence of decisions made here in this Parliament and will be felt for years to come. That's where the energies of Parliament should lie. Focus on that, not offloading blame elsewhere. One reason why so many workers are demoralised and burnt out, as we've heard here today, is staff shortages, struggling to recruit and retain staff for even minimum services in, day out. And I'm all for the government trying to tackle this. It'll need some courageous, creative, radical solutions, and some of these might lead to clashes with trade unions. So be it. For example, I think we need to look at a 7-day NHS provision. I think GP surgeries should be open over weekends and longer hours. I'm impressed by the work of renal consultant Dr. Andrew Stein and his 7DS policy that wants to get more consultants into hospitals over weekends and get elective surgery 7 days a week. And no doubt some of those ideas will clash with the BMA. So what? I support the rights of trade unions, but I don't put them on a pedestal. There might be clashes with unions, I've no doubt about it, if we shake up the public services and deal with the huge task of recruiting more staff to tackle our problems. But this bill is counterproductive and won't work. Does the Minister think that it's productive use of overstretched public services personnel to have to invest time and resources to work out who needs to be in work, how many people and where, in order to create work notices? What a bureaucratic waste of time. More management red tape. Great. Finally, on the public. There's no doubt that the strikes are disruptive, a real pain, creating more obstacles to negotiate just to get through the day, and scary sometimes in terms of whether you can call an ambulance and so on. And many parents, for example, feel betrayed by education unions who denied children and students even a minimum education over the COVID years, and feel bitter that so many public servants are still working from home and not providing adequate face-to-face services. So to the unions, I think there's no room for complacency. After all, only 23% of workers are members of a union, so unions need to work proactively to win hearts and minds beyond their members. But to the government, don't make assumptions about the public and where they'll land on this issue. Don't treat them as your own army. I think that the public are intelligent enough to work this out. And a great notice that we got in preparation for this from a group called Organise made the point that many non-unionists support these strikes, and actually their message is we stand in solidarity, and so do I.
Many of those who have spoken